Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Perspective. In studio with me today is a school principal and author, and we're going to talk about his very interesting book. It's called A Journey of the Muslims and Their Heritage from the Cape to New Clare. And who doesn't know about the suburb of New Clare? In the western parts of Johannesburg. I think we all have connections to that suburb, don't we? So let's get talking about the reason this book was written. What can we expect when we get hold of the book and start reading it, and how's it going to change our perceptions of Muslims and the suburb in fact as well? Assalamu alaikum to you. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you here, Zainodeen Moosa. For the purposes of this interview, do you mind if I refer to you as Gino?
Everybody does, eh?
Okay, welcome. So, I think the big question is why this book. Can you tell us about your upbringing in New Clare? Okay. You've told me off air that you still have a sister living there. You've moved on to Bosmont, which is a neighbouring suburb of New Clare, of course. And how the environment, how growing up in New Clare has shaped you as a person, a personality, and your thoughts and reflections after having written the book of the suburb called New Clare.
Okay, very interesting question. I think let's start off from the outset by saying I was raised and born in New Clare. I come from a family that's always been involved in teaching. My dad has been involved in, basically a pioneer in establishing the New Clare Madrasa. He taught with Amikara, Chapi, at New Clare Primary School. That's prior to the mosque being built. My uncles were involved in the madrasa, all teachers, so it was invariable or inevitable that I would also become a teacher. My sister was also a teacher at some point. So, grew up in New Clare, was at the madrasa from the age 4, 5, completed madrasa. My father then wrote me in to become a ustad, then also mandated me to go and recruit additional teachers when I went to teaching college, brought those guys on board, and they've also been involved in the mosque as we speak currently still. So, and after that for my sons, got involved with the committee, eventually became the chairperson of the committee, then retired and left that, and now been recruited back as the principal of the madrasa.
You wear very many hats, don't you? I mean, your journey does span teaching, and currently, of course, the Muslim school in New Clare. But you've also been involved in corporate leadership, coaching and cultural preservation. How has these different roles influenced your world view, and particularly cultural preservation? How important is that aspect in your life and your community?
So I think there's multiple facets to the question. But to start from the outset, I think I've always been a people's person. So naturally was drawn towards teaching. But realized that for me at that stage in my life, that wasn't enough. Went into the corporate world, became an HR executive and an HR director at various banks. Then thereafter went on to become a chief operating officer at a construction company. Then decided to retire. That's when I had the idea to get into the book. But for me, the second part of your question is in terms of how has that shaped me culturally. I think it's important for us, as I call it Malay Muslims, to know our culture, to know our heritage, and where we come from. We come from good stock, as I always say. And I think that is being, for lack of a better word, we're being marginalized. And for me, I've had this book in mind for the last 15 odd years, but I just never had the time. With the advent of COVID and towards the end of it, I actually had some time and decided to actually apply my mind and write my story.
You talk about being marginalized. I kind of wonder what was the defining moment that inspired you to start writing this book. And you talk about a journey of Muslims and their heritage from the Cape to New Clare. You also talk about coming from good stock. And I'm wondering if you are referring to the days of the political prisoners from the East to Cape Town, and yet despite that amazing heritage, you still talk about being marginalized.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think, and if you read the book, it's multifaceted in my mind. So there's a historical background that takes us back to 1652, with the advent or the arrival of what I call slaves, known in a colonial term. But for me, these were political fighters, freedom fighters.
They were also royalty, were they
Royalty,
not?
absolutely. And they actually resisted the Dutch imperialist or colonialist movement. And for their struggles and efforts, they were brought down to the Cape, which was then a penal colony, to try and marginalize and silence them. Not being aware that coming here, as I always say, Islam came to South Africa by default. But we always know Allah Ta'ala knows best in terms of, He is the best of planners. But having said that, because they came here, they were able to establish Islam. And with that bring, as I always call it, the Malayo-Indonesian culture with that. And that's for me the beginning of the resistance and the struggle and our heritage.
Malaysian and Indonesian culture was very, very strong, possibly still quite strong in the Western Cape. Do you believe that with the advent of time it's been diluted? How far has that dilution gone? And are you saddened by it? And if so, are the Malay community as a whole trying to revive all their traditions and also very proudly own their identity?
I think, again, a multifaceted question. Firstly is, I think our culture is being eroded. And that for me is because of two issues. One, modernity, and two, the lack of us understanding our tradition and our heritage, where we come from. I know there's revivalist movements throughout, but I don't think there's been enough is being done. And hence for me, I thought, write the book, capture what we can in terms of the oral narratives and oral stories of people before we lose that. But having said that, I think there is a need for us to revive our heritage and our culture, because Islam in South Africa exists for approximately 365 years. And for me, the question also, which I pose in the book, is what next? We are where we are today because of our heritage, because of our culture, because of all these syncretic practices that I speak of. But what are we doing in our current state to promote Islam, to sustain Islam, to protect Islam for the next 365 years? And hence I say, for me, I've got a few ideas in the book in terms of saying what we should do as 21st century Muslims with, obviously, I call it Malay Muslims, because I don't think we can speak anymore of a Cape Malay. And that for me is also part of the colonial labor in terms of stigmatizing us and boxing us into groupings, because our Malayo culture has evolved. We're no longer part of the Cape. We're living in Gauteng, yet we still have those cultures. So I speak about a Malay Muslim.
You talk about Malay Muslims, and we do know that with the eradication of apartheid, we've had lots of people from all around the world that have come to South Africa, and we have Muslims from very many different nationalities. It's vast, and they all come with a very rich culture. Do you see at some point in all of these different Muslim nationalities possibly merging or getting together more often and sharing their values, their cultural values, exchanging them with each other, but without losing their identity? And do you believe that's important?
Absolutely. I think that's vital for our survival. But again, I go back and I say, we need to do introspection as Muslims, and I'm speaking in general now, in that the world that's this whole concept of Islamophobia. And we're falling prey to that. And we focus on what I want to call petty issues, and sex, and this madhab and that madhab, and this grouping and that grouping, as opposed to us first looking at the golden thread, which is us being Muslim, and what our Islamic values should be, and use that as a base to start building on creating what I want to call unity as an ummah, as opposed to operating as sectarian sects, which takes us nowhere.
So you have written this book highlighting or talking about the journey of the Muslims and their heritage from the Cape to nuclear. But you also speak very strongly about our Muslim identity, which is really should be the overriding force regarding anything else that really identifies us. And yet you've written that book. Why is it important?
For me, it's about creating what I want to call survival. We come from this notion, as I speak in the book, about decolonial practice, that we've been trained and marginalized and using old colonial frameworks. But for me, it's about us transforming, using what I want to speak about, revitalizing and regaining our history. And for me, part of that history is looking at the various, I call it syncretic practices, your ratibs, your khadats, your tamats, your weddings, how those things, albeit people might say it's cultural, but Islam has allowed for culture to be fused with the religion as long as the culture does not supersede. And for me, we're losing the cultural aspect and only focusing on the pure religious aspects, which as any human society can't operate in isolation. And for me, hence the book, in terms of saying, here's an opportunity for us to look at what our history is about, what our culture is about, what our culinary experiences are about, and let's not lose all of that.
It's something we need to pass down to future generations.
Because those, sorry to break your word, because those are the real issues that actually sustained Islam.
Let's go for an ad break. My guest is Zainodeen Moosa, known as Gino. We're talking about his book. It is called A Journey of the Muslims and Their Heritage from the Cape to Nuclear. Lots more coming up right after the break. Welcome back. I'm talking to a school principal and also an author. He's just published his first book, and it's called A Journey of the Muslims and Their Heritage from the Cape to Nuclear. So welcome back, Gino. And
Thank you.
Has the book already been published?
It's with the publishers as we speak. They're busy printing it.
Okay, so these are just...
This is just a sample.
Sample copies that have been going around.
Yeah.
I've actually paged through the book and I was absolutely fascinated by the personalities that you have featured in the book. And I might also add a few of the personalities are very known to me and in fact connected to me. So let's talk about, you said the book was 15 years in the making.
Yeah.
The inspiration around the book and when you approach members of the community to talk about their history in nuclear, how welcoming were they?
Look, again, going back, like you said, 15 years for me in the making. It's always been a dream, not to just write a book, but to write a book about our history. The challenges I had initially was I wanted to collaborate with various people. And I pretty soon realized that there's always this delay or that delay and different agendas. Hence, I decided to go on my own. And I can probably say to my biggest encouragement was my wife, in terms of saying, go your own and get it done. So approximately about 4.5 years ago, I decided to actually start. And what triggered that was the fact that I started prepping and interviewing people, but not taking it serious in a sense. And it was just very casual initially. But many of these old guys started dying. And I realized that the history and the oral history is being lost. Hence, I started formally doing that. And the second part of your question is, how responsive were they? Exceptional. When you speak, we ask people about, for example, about Fitas, about nuclear, about the mosque that was a shack initially in Dowling Street, and when they were in nuclear, people speak with reverence. You can see their faces light up, and they continue talking. You have to actually stop them and guide them back in terms of this, because it's reminiscing about this and that in the good old days. So it was very exciting and very interesting. And to date, as we speak, I had to at some point cut off, because there's still people coming to me and say, you know, I've got this story, I've got that story. So for me, it's probably a first edition. We'll probably have to add more stories on. in terms of additional people and their personalities and their contribution to not only nuclear but also to the mosque.
Your story or your book is very central to the mosque.
Yes.
Back in the day and even currently, the mosque seems to be very, and rightly so, rightfully so, very central to the togetherness of the community. How has it changed from the time you were growing up to the current situation in nuclear?
That's a good question. I think if I look at my time, for us as children growing up, the mosque was a playground. You'd be in the mosque, running around. That was home for us. So being at madrasa, after madrasa Sundays, there would have been khadats or programs and so on. The mosque has changed, and I think not only nuclear, all mosques, where I become very critical and say the mosque should not only be a place for ritual praise. The mosque should be the hub for the community.
Absolutely.
As it was in the time of the Prophet and throughout. So I know nuclear in particular have started reviving, and there's more social commitments and social issues. There's also now not necessarily zakah fund and so on, but there are social, what I want to call social initiatives to try and revive and get more people to come to the mosque and not only use it as a place of worship.
The mosque, as you indicate, is obviously in nuclear. We do know that lots of the families have moved on.
Yeah.
Their situations have improved through education and other such factors. The area itself seems to have attracted people that are on the lower social strata. They have to be housed somewhere, and like you rightly also put it, that the mosque should be the central hub. You mentioned the word zakat, so I'm thinking now that it serves a very big role to the poorer communities in the surrounding areas. Is it in fact doing that?
Absolutely. I think they're trying. Doing it is one thing in terms of getting it right, but I think for me there's a couple of issues. One is, yes, you're absolutely right in terms of saying the socioeconomic level of the community.
The demographics has
changed. But for me, what is paramount, or what the mosque should do and the committees should do, is not only having zakah, feeding schemes and giving out parcels. What I want to propagate is to say we must encourage people to become competent in skills. There are many people, I think, there were electricians, plumbers, etc., who could be utilized differently as opposed to just getting out, a handout in terms of feeding them. What we're lacking in our community, and I think most communities, we focus on giving zakah, giving out parcels and handouts. So we're making our people become dependent as opposed to becoming self-sufficient and independent. And I think that is, for me, the challenge that our committee and future committees must have in our communities to try and alleviate poverty, but create what I want to speak about, people becoming self-sustainable.
Absolutely. So clearly you've been thinking long and hard about self-sustainability. What type of ideas are going on in your head right now? And have you contained any of that in the book?
Some in the book, yes, towards the latter chapters, in terms of saying, these are some suggestions that I have, humbly.
Share it with me, share it with our viewers.
So, for example, start with the imamat. It should not only be you standing in front of the mimbar and performing a ritual praise. The mosque should become a propagation center. That's, for me, the outset. Nuclear is bordering on, as we call it, squatter camps. How did Islam start from the outset? Reach out to the poor. Get them to see the beauty of Islam and not become dictatorial in terms of saying Islam says this, that, and the other. Invite people in and let them see the beauty of Islam. One. Two, I think we must look at education. Education in the sense that let's not only focus on what I want to speak about, the fundamental Islamic principles and values and so on, but also show them, as I try and explain in the book, to say where did our history start from an Islamic perspective in South Africa, how our forefathers came here with nothing. Their privileges were taken away, coming here into a desolate country with nothing, and they had Islam. They memorized the Quran. They could write the Quran from memory. We speak about the Tuan Gurus. We speak about one of the other princes that actually gave a copy of the Quran handwritten to the governor, Simon van der Stel. So those are the things that we need to bring back in terms of saying there is a heritage, there is, for me, a background that we could fall back onto, but also looking at other aspects like from a social perspective, as I said, is why not create what I want to call a hub where we can have like a call center. And the mosque, for example, you have a problem with your plumbing. You phone somebody at the mosque, they will then connect you to a plumber. The plumber, you pay the mosque will then pay the plumber. We create employment. We can do the same with electricity. There's so many, for example, mechanics and so on, people that have the skills but are unemployed and they can't get back into mainstream, the mainstream economy in terms of work. So those are the type of initiatives I think the mosque should play a central role in, as opposed to just being a place of worship.
Sounds an absolutely wonderful idea. And can you imagine if this is replicated throughout the entire country, mosques in all areas, but in Nuclear specifically, and I should imagine other areas like El Dorado Park, etc., there's a huge problem of unemployment, and what you're suggesting could close that gap. But however, it is a huge undertaking. You're going to need lots of commitment from other members and other parties as well to make it possible. But nothing is impossible, of course.
True.
How do you propose to take this to the next step or the next level?
For me, and as I said, it's a simple thing. I think every mosque has a committee. So it should be, what we need to do is create what I want to call a chairperson's forum, for lack of a better terminology. Excuse me, and get the different chairpersons from the different masajids to get together, and because I think the problems are similar throughout. If you look at the socio-economic issues, as you speak, El Dorado Park, Rivoli, Westbury, etc. And let's look at those issues in terms of saying, let's come up with a 5-year plan. A 5-year plan that says the following: 1, let's try and change our education system. Have the same, for example, in the Madaris, the same education system. 2, let's look at, from an economic perspective, let's look at what we can do in terms of employment. Create these type of hubs as I propose and see how that can work. Yes, initially it will be difficult because people will not trust. But if we can vet the quality of mechanics, plumbers, electricians, etc., people will come and use that. It's already being done in other sectors, but here we can do it in our own communities and create sustainability within our community. So I think we need to have that dialogue with the respective leaders and activists within the communities to try and get this and resuscitate what I think could create sustainability from an economic and a social perspective.
Sounds awesome. Let's go for a break. I am talking with Gino Moosa, and he's in fact here to talk to us about the book that he's just written. It will go, obviously it will be available in, I should imagine, the next few weeks' time. But we'll talk more about the book a little later on. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking with Zainodeen Gino Moosa about his book, and it is entitled A Journey of the Muslims and Their Heritage from the Cape to Nuclear. So, Gino, undoubtedly, the questions that, I've been asking you throughout the interview, all of those answers are in fact contained in the book. But in your research, what would you say were the stories that really stood out for you about resilience and survival?
I think I'll start off by saying, if I look at resilience, I look at how our forefathers came here to South Africa with nothing. They were basically shipped up because they were rebels, brought here, but for them it wasn't a hopeless situation. They had their Islam, they had their integrity, they had their ethics and morality, as I speak about, And that for me was the foundation. So those things in terms of the history, for me, that is what captured me in terms of saying, wow. And 365 years later, Islam still exists. So for me, that was captivating in that sense. But if you look at going forward and you look at what I want to speak about, the Malay Muslims' resilience, you look at the Imam Haruns, you look at our involvement as Muslims in the UDF, in the pre-apartheid struggles, we look at post-apartheid, we had a strong presence. And you look at now, for me, how marginalized we become. So for me, it was all about that. But you look at beyond the resilience, it's also for me the perseverance in terms of saying we are resolute in terms of ensuring that as Muslims we survive. Hence, the Quran, for example, you'll take a person like Tuan Guru, who wrote the Quran from memory in prison while she was there for the last 13 years. And for me, that history is not captured. That history our children don't know of. There's another person, for example, like Sheikh Ahmed Termidi, who's been on Robben Island for 65 years. Nobody knows that. And then we speak about Mandela, for example, who's been on Robben Island or in prison for 27 years, but all 27 years was not on Robben Island. So for a person to have a life, basically 65 years on Robben Island, nobody knows about that. And for me, that's the history that's missing. And those are the things that I think stood out for me. But more so also, if I look at things, for example, when I interviewed people and had these oral conversations with them, how their faces lit up when, for example, they would speak about fitas. For example, if there's something that comes to mind now is the tamats, which is the graduations. How proud they would be to say, I tamated in 1952 as an example, and how we marched through the streets of fitas so that all in Sundry could see I actually came of age. I could read the Quran, I completed the Quran, and now I am a proud Muslim. So for me, those are the stories that stand out.
Those are very beautiful traditions that were upkept by our forefathers.
Yeah.
Do you think that they're beginning to die out, like your dupmals, your tamats, your rampis cutting, and all other such very beautiful traditions that speaks about who you are as a Malay Muslim? And several times in the interview you have spoken about being marginalized. What in specific are you alluding to when you talk about marginalization?
So if we go back, let's just look at what you're saying in the outset of your question, is these cultures and traditions, for me, a lot of people speak about bid'ah and this, that and the other, but Islam allows for culture to fuse with religion, and more so, all of these traditions or syncretic practices, I call it, it's based on an Islamic base and the prophetic ways. So there's nothing untoward, but that's a debate for another day. But those things are important in terms of sustainability and survival of our religion. But I think what is important is that we mustn't forget that we are where we are today because of those cultural practices. And what we must do is revive it. But I think it mustn't just be what, again, I want to speak about ritualistic revival. It must be a revival with context. For example, where does Khadat come from? Where does the Mawlud come from? So, for example, if you look at the Mawlud as an example, these are litanies around the Prophet. It's revering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's about those things that bring a sense of communal spirit. But more so, it's also about, especially in this 21st century that we're in, it's about bringing communities together. As you rightfully said earlier, because of the post-apartheid, people have moved off into different areas. So the one thing that apartheid did well was keep our communities together. And that we've lost. So these cultural practices and cultural events should be a force to bring people back together. And I think that's, for me, what we should cotton on to in terms of creating that, let's call it enthusiasm and love to understand our religion. And
you talk about culture and how it keeps people together, cultural practices. But what I worry about is the youth of today. Are they interested enough to uphold these traditions? Because it's tied directly in with our culture. And do you believe they're going to be interested enough to read the book and trace their history? Because it is a piece of their history, is it not?
Yeah. I think that's a loaded question. I think our youth today, and I suppose us as parents, are to be blamed, in the sense that, as I spoke earlier to you about modernity, we are trying to be too modern, and in the process of trying to be modern, we're eroding our culture, our values, at the expense of what I want to call the Western world. We need to create, and that's going to be a difficult challenge in terms of trying to find an alternative, in terms of saying, leave the cell phone, leave this or that, but perhaps the other option could be to say, use technology so that we can instill these cultural things and create a platform for them that's totally different from our generation in terms of how we grew up. So that is going to be a challenge, but I think it's a challenge worth fighting for, because if we lose our youth, we don't have a future. And for me, that's the scary part. And hence I thought, write the book in some way, form or shape. Hopefully somebody will read and see and get intrigued and captivated and saying, wow, is this what we're all about? Is this what our forefathers did? Is this what our grandparents did? And what are we going to do going forward?
You spoke just now about Khadat. Just explain the beauty and the reasoning behind the Khadat.
Okay.
And obviously that would be one way of keeping the community together and bringing our young people in to appreciate the beauty of Islam.
So let's start off by saying, where did Khadat start? Khadat started, in my research, from Imam Haddad in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. Studied in Makkah, from Yemen, and brought that there. Then if you look at what our forefathers did, for example, Sheikh Yusuf Makassar, etc., who also studied in Makkah, but also studied in Yemen. And they brought back together. So what is a Khadat all about? A Khadat is about looking at revering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, also speaking about revering the Prophet and so on, and putting these things together in a form that would help or sustain Islam. Now, if you take it to when our forefathers came here in the 17th century, it was using Khadat as a means to uphold Islam. And what is unique about South African Khadat, if you want to call it that way, is that it's got a melodious tune. And that was done primarily to pull wool over the slave masters, in terms of them thinking they're singing. Yet they were very spiritual and very in the Tasawwuf tariq. So that was all part of doing this and
preserving
the
religion. And as I also understood it, is that the Muslim slaves met once a week on a Thursday, when they then read the Khadat.
Yeah.
And like you rightly say, they pull the wool over the slave master's eyes into thinking that they were having a sing-along or whatever.
Yes, yeah.
In the meantime, they were performing Khadat, alhamdulillah.
Yeah. And so it's, like you rightly say, it's actually 2 days. It was the Thursday night, which was obviously Laylatul Jumu'ah, and so for that, but also on a Sunday, because on the Sunday the slave masters would go off to church, and they would then get together and then perform the Khadats. So those were 2 significant days, for whatever reasons that we still do currently, but it's because of those days, and that tradition was passed along.
And alhamdulillah, up to today, we are still observing the Khadat when there is a janazah, or when people just want to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be in a gathering of like-minded people. So I do know Khadat is practiced pretty regularly in the Malay community, subhanallah for that. Once again, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be into our final segment, and we're going to wrap up by talking about the amazing personalities that you have documented in your book.
Happy.
So please do stay with us. Gino Moosa is my guest. He hails from New Clare, moved on to Bosmont in Johannesburg, but hasn't lost his ties to the suburb of New Clare. In fact, he's written a book on New Clare, and central to the book is the theme and the masjid, and how important a role does masjids play in the lives of Muslims. Having said that, Gino, how does New Clare Masjid's history compare to the earliest masjids or masajids in South Africa, particularly to the one in Kirk Street in Johannesburg?
Okay. Look, I think difficult comparison to make, because Kirk Street was also found, as I would want to say, out of desperation, because initially there was no mosque, and the Muslims had, as it was then coined as Malay camp, so they had an area where they performed the salah and so on. And then later on, again because of the influx of different groupings, because of the discovery of gold, you had Africans, Chinese, etc. And it became a slum area. The Muslims then appealed to Paul Kruger for an area, and he actually gave them, because they actually sided with Paul Kruger and the Dutch against the British. And so that's how Kirk Street was built. By Malays, not a cent from government, out of their pockets. And as you obviously know, that the Malays are very good in terms of being artisans, so I speak about it in the book as well, that it was all built by the community, giving charity and donations, etc.
And in subsequent years, even though the mosque was built by the Malay artisans back in the day, that area, the downtown Johannesburg area, then was really a lot of Indian Muslims then inhabited the area, and over time that was the community that used the Kirk Street Mosque.
Correct, yes.
And of course, in this day and age, everybody's moved out, or most people have moved out. So that mosque serves the people who work in downtown Johannesburg.
Correct, yes, yeah. And if you look at then what happened, if just in terms of historical context, the Muslims obviously then moved into Pageview, as we passionately know it as Fitas. And that's when 23rd Street Mosque was built. And again, that land was given by Paul Kruger. And there's a whole history around that too, but I don't think we've got enough time.
For the next time, we definitely do need to talk some more about this amazing history that you have contained in your book, but you do concentrate mainly on the Malay Muslim community from the western suburbs of Johannesburg, mainly New Clare, etc., New Clare, Bosmont, and so forth. Let's talk about some of the very colourful and important characters that you highlight in your book. We don't have time to focus on too many, but a few that come to mind.
If I look at, just to share with you, so post the Group Areas Act, I then zoned in on New Clare in terms of saying, so how did Islam get to New Clare? And then the history takes you back to 1918. So colourful characters, for example, would be the Wali Ali family, who actually started the masjid. And later on, you speak about the Budanias, who got involved. And the nice thing about what I write about is how the administrators of the mosque kept solid records of these things. So, I mean, I actually in the book have an article that Budania wrote, as he was the project manager in terms of building the masjid. Then there's other personalities like Ibrahim Wadwala, whom you probably would know very well, who was instrumental in securing the rights with the city officials at that time, with another personality, Amikara, who was the original principal, and unfortunately he passed on just as the mosque was completed, and then obviously with my dad being involved. And then I speak about the various personalities. There's the Latif brothers, Uncle Babu and Ibrahim Latif, Haji Ibi, who were involved. I also then speak about my uncles. I speak about the three Moosa brothers, my father, Bawa Rashid Moosa and Rempi, who my father got involved as teachers. Rashid eventually went on to become the chairperson of the institute, Rempi. Then there's other personnel that I speak about as teachers who's been there for 25 odd years in terms of service to the institute, like Fatima Jardine, my aunt Ruwaida, and I look at other personalities in terms of, besides the teachers, I then also look at some of the imams. But again, I'm not going to belabor that because I want people to buy the book and read.
Absolutely. Let's just come back to the present and we talk about the socio-economic issues plaguing the area of nuclear, and they are huge, as we know. What is the powers that be regarding addressing that issue? And I talk about the powers that be, the mosque committees, because I do believe they have a huge role to undertake and they can make a meaningful difference. What are your thoughts around that?
For me, it's about, as I said earlier, we need to recapture our youth. We've lost the youth. So, for example, if I just look at the madrasa in its current state, when I was still teaching there, we had over 450 children that would come from all walks of life to nuclear. We're sitting now on probably 150. And one could probably attribute that to saying people migrated out of nuclear. But what we need to do is capture the youth that we have currently. And for me, it's, for example, it's, blending not only, as I want to call it, education, but also making it fun. So, for example, I have now introduced a sports day to try and get the youth to come back and get involved in some way, shape or form. We're also involved in, for example, now we're going to have an ethics and morality discussion around Palestine and getting our youth involved. So our youth, for example, will have a play on that particular day. I'm also getting a student in that will speak about ethics around Palestine and Israel, but also bringing and localizing it in terms of saying within our community what are the social evils, drugs, gangsterism, lack of employment, women abuse, etc. And those issues must become top of mind. And we need to conscientize our youth to say these are things that we shouldn't do ethically.
And we need to talk about it in the classroom,
in the classrooms,
and also at the mimbar.
Correct.
It's very important that that is done. That does happen, in fact. Earlier on, you spoke about the squatter camps around nuclear. Any plans to get dawah work going there and attract more reverts, inshallah, to the masjid and grow our Muslim population in the area?
I think that's a challenge that we have, and I think that's a challenge that I would suggest to the committee to say we must take up. But it must be done in a structured manner. But what I do know is that there's a lot of work happening, and for example, we also have a preschool. And I know there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's some of the children from the squatter camps that's actually come into our preschool. One, because the fee structure is amenable, but two, I think it's also an opportunity for us to showcase what we as Muslims can be and what we're about, so that's how we actually do dawah, not necessarily by selling the Quran or propagating about Islam. It's just by how we live as Muslims.
Absolutely. To wrap up then, we've got a couple of minutes more. What more can you tell us about the book? How are you going to make the book attractive enough for people to go out and buy it, and then, of course, connect with the history? Because that is what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping people like you can help in terms of marketing the book, but I think more so for me it's selling the book in the sense of saying, for me there's four or five aspects that I try and achieve in the book. It's one is there's a history. So anybody that's interested in a history, anybody that's interested in South African context must read the book, because it will give you context in terms of a community and what their struggles were, what their resilience was like, and how they survived colonialism and actually instilled Islam. The second is also about saying, as a marginalized community, we have a role to play in South Africa, and as a marginalized community, we shouldn't just sit back and let things pass us by and revel around the past and say That's what our forefathers did. We need to challenge ourselves and say, what are we going to do taking this process forward? And I think more so, it's also around, for me, inclusivity and saying, we always speak about this rainbow South Africa, but what is it about this rainbow that we are about? And we have a place, and we should be proud in terms of saying we have made a contribution to South Africa, to the economic, social, and political landscape, and we're not going anywhere. So for me, that's in essence what the book is about.
We're here to stay, and we need people to understand who we are as a community. A Malay community, but a Muslim Malay community. Does that, very quickly, does that label still hold Muslim or Malay Muslim? Or how do the community feel about that identification, Malay Muslim?
That's I've coined that. That's why I say it's a personal perspective. But I think we should evolve as South Africans to being called South Africans.
South African Muslims.
South Africans, but have your Islam and your Malay identity, rather your Islamic identity. Because for too long, I mean, we're 30 years into our democracy, and for too long, we've still been segmented and stigmatized. You are Malay, or you are Cape Malay, you are colored, you are white, you are black, you are this. And that for me still creates what I want to call schisms within our society. And we need to emotionally move away from that and just be South Africans. Whether you have a Christian identity, whether you have a Muslim identity, but become South Africans first. Obviously, in our case,
Muslim first,
yeah.
Absolutely, and that's where we're going to leave it.
Yeah.
Thank you indeed. Sounds very interesting. I'm going to get my hands on the book and give you feedback after I've read it. Lots and lots of luck for the launch of the book and for the big dreams and ideas you have for the Malay Muslim community in Newclear and surrounding areas. Thank you. May Allah be with you. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Assalamu rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And that's where we leave it. Thank you for watching. Till the next time, as always, Assalamu alaikum and Khuda Hafiz.